Heaven or Hell? Brief History of Kashmir. In 1819, the Kashmir Valley passed from the control of the Durrani Empire of Afghanistan, and 4 centuries of Muslim rule under the Mughals and the Afghans, to the conquering armies of the Sikhs under Ranjit Singh of Punjab. Gulab Singh distinguished himself in campaigns, especially the annexation of the Kashmir Valley, and, for his services, was appointed governor of Jammu in 1820. With the help of his officer, Zorawar Singh, Gulab Singh soon captured for the Sikhs the lands of Ladakh and Baltistan to the east and northeast, respectively, of Jammu. During the Anglo-Sikh War, Gulab Singh contrived to hold himself aloof till the Battle of Sobraon, 1846, when he appeared as a useful mediator and the trusted advisor of Sir Henry Lawrence. Under the Treaty of Amritsar, Britishers freed Gulab Singh from obligations towards the Sikhs and made him the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir. British rule ended in India in 1947 with the creation of 2 new states, India and Pakistan. The British paramountcy over 562 princely states ended. States were thereafter left to choose whether to join India or Pakistan or remain independent. Maharaja Hari Singh decided to stay independent because he expected the state's majority Muslim population would be unhappy if accession to India, and the Hindus and Sikh population would become vulnerable if he joined Pakistan. On August 11, the Maharaja dismissed his Prime Minister Ramchandra Kak, who had advocated independence. Observers and scholars interpret this action as a tilt towards accession to India. Pakistanis decided to preempt this possibility by wresting Kashmir by force if necessary. Pakistan made various efforts to persuade the Maharaja of Kashmir to join Pakistan. Faced by Maharaja's indecision, the Pakistani Authority in Pakistani Punjab region waged a private war by obstructing the supplies of fuel and essential commodities. The Jammu region of the state got caught up in the partition violence. The Pakistani tribal invasion and the uprising of Muslims in western Jammu brought the matters to a head. Maharaja's troops, heavily outnumbered and outgunned and facing internal rebellions from Muslim troops, had no chance of withstanding the attack. The Maharaja made an urgent plea to Delhi for military assistance. Upon the Governor-General Lord Mountbatten's insistence, India required the Maharaja to accede before it could send troops. Before that, Nehru demanded that the jailed political leader, Sheikh Abdullah, be released from prison and involved in the state government. Maharaja released Sheikh Abdullah on 29 Sept. Accordingly, the Maharaja signed an instrument of accession on 26 October 1947, which was accepted by the Governor-General the next day. Since only the people, not the Maharaja, could decide where Kashmiris wanted to live, it was a provisional accession. National Conference, the largest political party in the state and headed by Sheikh Abdullah, endorsed the accession and people's support of it. The Indian troops, which were airlifted in the early hours of October 27, secured the Srinagar airport. The city of Srinagar was being patrolled by the National Conference volunteers, with Hindus and Sikhs moving about freely among Muslims, an incredible sight to visiting journalists. The National Conference also worked with the Indian Army to secure the city. In north of state lay Gilgit Agency. Gilgit's population did not favor the accession to India. Sensing their discontent, Major William Brown, the Maharaja's commander of the Gilgit Scouts, telegraphed Khan Abdul Qayyum Khan, Chief Minister of Azad Kashmir, to take over the administration of Gilgit. Rebel forces from the western districts of the state and the Pakistani Pashtun tribesmen made rapid advances into the Baramulla sector. In the Kashmir Valley, National Conference volunteers worked with the Indian Army to drive out the raiders. The resulting First Kashmir War lasted until the end of 1948. In May 1948, the Pakistani Army officially entered the conflict, in theory to defend the Pakistan borders, but it made plans to push towards Jammu and cut the lines of communications of the Indian forces in the Mendar Valley, and this was the beginning of Pakistan using irregular forces and asymmetric warfare to ensure plausible deniability, which has continued ever since. According to Jinnah, India acquired the accession through fraud and violence. Following the setup of the United Nations Commission for India and Pakistan, UNCIP, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 47 on 21 April 1949. The measure called for the immediate ceasefire and called on the government of Pakistan to withdraw its forces and tribesmen who have entered Kashmir for the purpose of fighting. It also called the Indian government to reduce its forces to minimum, after which the circumstances for holding plebiscite should be put into effect. However, the ceasefire was not put into effect until January 1949. Both India and Pakistan failed to arrive at a truce agreement due to differences over interpretation of the procedure for and the extent of demilitarization. UNCIP made 3 visits between 1948 to 49, trying to find a solution agreeable to both India and Pakistan. In the end, no agreement could be reached between the two countries on the process of demilitarization, and the plebiscite never happened. On August 11, the Maharaja dismissed his Prime Minister Ramchandra Kak, who had advocated independence. Observers and scholars interpret this action as a tilt towards accession to India. Pakistanis decided to preempt this possibility by wresting Kashmir by force if necessary. Pakistan made various efforts to persuade the Maharaja of Kashmir to join Pakistan. Faced by Maharaja's indecision, the Pakistani Authority in Pakistani Punjab region waged a private war by obstructing the supplies of fuel and essential commodities. The Jammu Following its failure to seize Kashmir in 1947, Pakistan supported numerous covert cells in Kashmir using operatives based in its New Delhi embassy. After its military pact with the United States in the 1950s, in 1965 the conditions were ripe for successful guerrilla war in Kashmir operation named Gibraltar. It dispatched about 30,000 infiltrators into Indian-administered Kashmir, majority of whom were volunteers and mujahideen. The plan was to incite them to rebellion. If the attempt failed, Pakistan hoped to raise Kashmir issue internationally. Pakistan believed that it could achieve tactical victory in a quick limited war by using the sophisticated weapons it newly acquired through American aid. However, the Operation Gibraltar ended in failure as the Kashmiris did not revolt. Instead, they turned in infiltrators to the Indian authorities in substantial numbers, and the Indian Army ended up fighting the Pakistani Army regulars. On September 1, Pakistan launched an attack across the ceasefire line, targeting Ukhnur in an effort to cut Indian communications into Kashmir. In response, India broadened the war by launching an attack on Pakistani Punjab across the international border. The war lasted till September 23, ending in a stalemate. Following the Tashkent Agreement, both the sides withdrew to their pre-conflict positions, and agreed not to interfere in each other's internal affairs. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 led to a loss for Pakistan and a military surrender in East Pakistan. Bangladesh got created as a separate state. A bilateral summit was held in Shimla, as follow-up to the war and pushed for the peace in South Asia. At stake was the huge territory of Pakistan and 90,000 war prisoners of Pakistan. India was ready to return them in exchange for a durable solution to the Kashmir issue. In the personal meeting between Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the ceasefire line to be renamed as Line of Control. Accordingly, the Shimla Agreement was formulated and signed by the two countries, whereby the countries resolved to settle their differences by peaceful means through bilateral negotiations and to maintain the sanctity of the Line of Control. The Shimla Agreement also stated that the two sides would meet again for establishing durable peace. The envisioned meeting never occurred. Sheikh Abdullah, watching the alarming turn of events in the subcontinent, realized that for the survival of this region there was an urgent need to stop pursuing confrontational politics and promoting solution of issues by a process of reconciliation and dialogue rather than confrontation. He started talks with the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi for normalizing the situation in the region and came to an accord called 1975 Indira-Sheikh Accord, by giving up the demand for a plebiscite in lieu of the people being given the right to self-rule by a democratically elected government, as envisaged under Article 370 of the Constitution of India. rather than the puppet government which till then ruled the state. The central government withdrew its support so that the assembly had to be dissolved and mid-term election called. Sheikh's party won election and he remained chief minister until his death in 1982. Later his son Farooq Abdullah succeeded him as chief minister. In 1987 assembly election JKN coalition won 66 seats, and Farooq Abdullah was reappointed as chief minister of state. The MUF, Muslim United Front, largely current Hurriyat, led by Syed Ali Shah Gilani was the main opponent of JKN in the election, won just 4 seats. Allegations of malpractices and rigging on JKN coalition led to the disillusionment of Kashmiris. Accompanied by rampant corruption by coalition, the government failed to administer the state effectively. In this environment, secessionist and subversive elements started claiming that they had been denied democratic rights illegally and began justifying a recourse to unconstitutional and other methods. It was in this environment that Pakistan encouraged Kashmiri youth to come across the line of control and receive arms training to begin an armed secessionist movement. The movement led insurgency in the state and hiatus of more than 300,000 Kashmiri Pundits. Ethnic cleansing of Kashmiri Pandits was an event that occurred on January 20, 1990 when most of the Pundit families were forced to flee from Kashmir Valley due to outbreak of terrorism. The estimate of Pandits having fled Kashmir ranges from approximately 100,000 to as high as 800,000 by 1990s. In 1989 JKLF began separatist insurgency for the independence of Kashmir. The group targeted Kashmiri Hindu for the first time when they killed Pundit Tika Lal Taplu, an advocate and a prominent leader of Bharatiya Janata Party in Jammu and Kashmir, in front of several eyewitnesses. This instilled fear in the Kashmiri Pundit community, especially as Taplu's killers were never caught. The JKLF and other Islamists went on to kill many other Kashmiri Hindus, including many prominent ones. On January 4, 1990, a local Urdu newspaper, Aftab, published a press release issued by Hizb ul-Mujahideen, asking all Pandits to leave the valley immediately. Another local paper, Al-Safa, repeats this expulsion order. Explosive and inflammatory speeches being broadcast from the public address systems of the mosques became frequent for years. Kargil War took place between India and Pakistan that took place between May and July 1999 in the Kargil district of Kashmir and elsewhere along the line of control, LOC. The cause of the war was the infiltration of Pakistani soldiers and Kashmiri militants into positions on the Indian side of the LOC. During the initial stages of the war, Pakistan blamed the fighting entirely on independent Kashmiri insurgents, but documents left behind by casualties showed involvement of Pakistani paramilitary forces. The Indian Army, supported by the Indian Air Force, recaptured a majority of the positions on the Indian side of the LOC infiltrated by the Pakistani troops and militants. Facing international diplomatic opposition, the Pakistani forces withdrew from the remaining Indian positions along the LOC. According to numbers stated by Nawaz Sharif, there were over 4,000 fatalities. India gave its official casualty figures as 527 dead and 1,363 wounded. On May 26, 2008, Central and State reached an agreement to transfer 99 acres, 0.40 km2, of forest land to the Sri Amarnathji Shrine Board, SASB, in the main Kashmir Valley to set up temporary shelters and facilities for Hindu pilgrims. This caused a controversy, with demonstrations from the Kashmir Valley against the land transfer and protests from the Jammu region supporting it. Hurriyat conference called rallies attended by more than 300,000 people. During the protests a dozen people were killed on both sides and hundreds injured. 2010 unrest protests and riots started in June 2010 after the Indian Army claimed to have killed 3 Pakistani infiltrators, but it was later revealed to be a case of a fake encounter. Protests occurred in a movement launched by Hurriyat Conference in June 2010, who called for complete demilitarization of Kashmir, removal of AFSPA and self-determination. The protesters attacked the police and paramilitary with stones and burnt down government buildings and police stations, In retaliation, security forces fired tear gas shells, rubber bullets, and live ammunition, resulted in 112 deaths and hundreds injured. The protests subsided after the Indian government announced a package of measures aimed at defusing the tensions in September 2010. Unrest started with the killing of Burhan Wani, a militant commander of the Kashmir-based Hizbul Mujahideen, by Indian security forces on July 8, 2016. Curfew imposed in all 10 districts of Kashmir Valley, and even mobile services were suspended by government. Protesters defied curfew with attacks on security forces and public properties. Schools, police stations, and other government properties were burnt down. Jammu and Kashmir police and Indian paramilitary forces used pellet guns, tear gas shells, rubber bullets, as well as assault rifles to disperse the crowd, resulting in the deaths of more than 90 civilians, with over 15,000 civilians injured. 2 security personnel also died, while over 4,000 personnel were injured in the riots. The curfew was relieved after a couple of months. Situation remained tense until the end of year.